Hello and welcome. This is Christian. In this video, I will cover the data binding in Angular. So here on the Angular site, you'll see that there are different ways of binding data to your Angular application. Now, there's this thing called the source to view and the view to source. Okay, and then the third one is the view to source to view. So this refers to the one-way binding and two-way binding. So look at the one-way binding here. There are a couple of ways you can do that. So there are two methods in the one-way binding. One is the direction going from the source to the view. Okay, source to the view. When we say source, we're talking about the code inside the class, which is the actual code. And then the view is the HTML template. Okay, so let's go back here in the code here. This is the example from the book. If you remember back in chapter 1, let me pull that in here. Okay, we did this example, this Hello World application, where you actually type something in the input box and it shows the text live on the screen above it, right? And the code is here. This example, we didn't talk about it in detail, but it's really an example of a two-way binding. Okay, so the example output looks like this. If you remember this, if I say hello world, this is me, right? You see that the data changes up here live. Okay, it's a two-way binding. I'm binding the data to the console, to the text field here, and at the same time, I'm just showing the data back out to the page here. Okay, so that's two-way binding, and that is down here. So we have the square brackets wrapped inside here, a pair of parentheses, and then the actual binding, which is called target. And our example, we're using the ng model, and I'll talk about that later, or maybe in a different video. But for now, let's look at the one-way binding first, from the source out to the view. Okay, you have three ways. One is using the expression like this. This is an Angular expression where you see a pair of double curlies like this, followed by an expression that is wrapped inside these curlies. It's called an Angular expression. Now, an expression can be like a any type of like mathematical operations, like you do, addition, subtraction, things like that. Some very simple expressions. You cannot do a lot more than that, right? Just very simple ones. Maybe you can use like the ternary operators and if not, things like that. So that's one way. Another way is using this square bracket, and then in here you put a target. Again, the target is whatever you are binding to, right? So in this case, it will be like an attribute and a tag. Like, for example, in the image element, you have the attribute called src, right? So you put src in here, and then the expression will be whatever it is going to be displayed for the src. It's the URL or the source to that image, for example. Okay, and this is the same thing. These two are identical. It's just a different way of how you use it. Some developers prefer to use the square brackets. Some prefer to use the word bind, followed by a dash and then the target. So it will be like bind dash src. Okay, so this is binding from the source out to the view. Okay. And let's see an example of that in the code. So here, back to our example, I'm going to load the component here for the app component. We've seen that before, and this is the template. Okay, so here's our hello world, and again, this is the two-way data binding, but we'll change that eventually. So let's talk about this component for a minute here. Before I move on, I want to explain a little bit about the word component and what it is. Okay, so I just want to say that component, when we say component in Angular, we're not referring to this file called app.component.ts. Okay, this file is just the file used to contain the component. The actual component is this guy right here. Okay, and also associated with that is this decorator called add component. This whole thing here plus this export class component is the component. Okay, so when we export that component, we export it using a class name. and we will reference this class name inside the module, as you can see. And the add module, we import that in from that app.component file. Okay, again, it's just a file that contains a class called app component. And then from there on, we use that inside the application. Okay, so another rule is that this export class app component must follow this app component directive or decorator immediately right after. You cannot put anything in between. Well, I mean, besides code, you can, like if you put a variable x something equals to 12, yeah, that's fine, that's okay. You can put those code in, that's okay. But as long as the class is concerned, okay, it has to be immediately defined after that component. Okay, so what that means is that if I do another export class, call it my app, right? If I just do something like that, okay, now this class called my app is associated with this template here. It's no longer this one. This one does not have a template to work with. Okay, so if I save this file, you will see that in the output it will fail. Okay, it doesn't work anymore. And if you do the inspection, you'll see that in the console it has some errors. It's because its app component is not declared by the module. It is declared, but you don't have the template associated with this, because in the app module we are importing the app component, which is this one, and there is no template for that. So if I were to copy this, okay, and put it right down here, it's the same thing, right? It doesn't matter, right? It's the same thing. As long as I have a component decorator to be used or attached to this class here, then it should be okay. As you can see, it comes right back as usual. Okay, so the component itself, they can share the same template. It doesn't matter. Well, it's a little bit tricky, but you can. Okay, so I just wanted to show you that don't confuse with the file name and the word component. They are not related at all. Okay, it's just the file name. It happens to be called app.component.ts, and again, the app.component.ts, you can call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Angular uses that because it's based on the convention. Okay, and so you can see that I can use both of them. And in here, I could have go back to the module because I have my app and the app component. So I can go here and include that in here as well. I can call multiple components here, my app. And if I want to use that, then I need to add that into the declarations here as well, my app. And so there it is, right? And of course, I don't think it'll show up here because I did not include that inside anywhere of the code, but it's in here. So if I want to change this to my app instead of the add module, the app component, my app, now it's actually using my app instead of the app component. Well, we can't tell because it's using the same template. If I go in here, and if I change this to something else, then it should work, right? So for example, if I change this, and I'll explain this a little bit as well for the template versus template URL. If I do something like that, okay, I'm using a very simple template. And if I save it, go back, you'll see that it changes to my template, which is my app component. Okay, so you can have a lot of components inside a single file. So you can have all your app components inside the single file. I mean, this is kind of like it's doing a disservice to the program, because the idea of a component is to have a component exist inside its own file so that you can debug easily. You can find the errors easily, because if I have like 100 components in this single file, it's really hard to maintain. Okay, so when we do that, then we break these out into their own separate components, and we import the actual component, which is a class, to a module like so, and we just use them. Okay, so I hope this is clear in this example here. So the next thing I want to talk about is the template. Now there is a difference between using the property template and template URL. Okay, this template here is when you want to include all the code for your template directly right here in this line as a string. So we call this the inline template. So this is the inline template. Okay, this one here uses another template. It's called the external template, right? Because we're calling the external file called app.component.html. Here we're using the actual code inside here. So if you forgot to change this and you're expecting to call an app template, a template, it's not going to work because it will treat this just plain text. Okay, and that's what I mean. Okay, so now that is what you see. It's just a template itself that lives inside this component decorator here. And you see in the book that if you build your app a template, it grows really large and it's much harder to see. So therefore, you break it and then you put it into external file and you just reference it here, and you have to change this property to template URL so you can call the external file like you see here. So you see before, all of these here can be put inside like here, right? I could put all of that here. Only thing is you have an issue because I'm using multi-lines. So that's why the book shows you put a single backtick here, and you end that backtick, I think it was like right down here. Yeah. So using the backtick allows you to do multi-lines in your code. So if I save this, you'll see that the site comes back just like the other template. Okay, I'm using the inline template so it's really hard to maintain. That is why you break it out and put into external file, and we maintain it that way. It's much easier. Okay, another thing is that this file, it doesn't have to be called app.component.html. This is, again, just convention. It's easier to look at it, to visually see it, that all of these refers to the app component or the app module. And inside my tag, for example, I have another one. It's called my tag, so I named them that way. But you don't have to call it that way if you don't want to. I mean, you shouldn't have it any other way, but you want to be consistent. So that's why. So another way, I can call this just XYZ or ABC, right? And if I save ABC, and if I change this to ABC, okay, it doesn't matter. It's as long as it's a valid HTML file, okay. And the app module, if I change back to the app component here, the Bootstrap one, you see that it should still work just fine. Okay, it's calling that app module. And how do I know? Well, I can make something here, put like a few exclamation there. You see that it changes up here. Okay, so hopefully that it's helpful in knowing the difference between the template and template URL and the component in here. All right, so let's undo all of these. Well, I'm just gonna keep this as that's fine, and I'll move that down here. I'll just go back to my app example. I don't want to mess up with the other the original one, so let me change this back to app.component HTML as it was, and I'll close that. So go back to the module. I'm going to change it back to my app. So we're going to use that as an example to show our data binding. Make sure it works. Okay, so did I do something wrong? Angular 2, hello world, ABC. Okay, ABC. I thought I changed that already. Or maybe I didn't change inside here. Okay. Nope. Down here. Okay. Let's see. Okay, so back to that template. I'm going to remove some of these tags here, and we'll just use a really simple example in here. I will close all of these, and I will use the inline style so we can see easily from here. I don't have to switch back and forth between the two. Okay, so here's the div between the header and that. Well, I don't need a header. I just close the header. I'll just use a container. Okay, so here I'll put the H1 back so we know what this is a data binding H1. So we should see data binding up here. Okay, so there it is. Now, data binding one direction from the source. Again, when I say the source to view is in here, this is the source. Okay, and out here is the view. Okay, this is the view, the template itself. So in other words, it's this view here. It's the same thing. Okay. So in the source, I have a data called title. Okay, this class here, it has to be defined next to the component here. If I have in between for another component, it only applies to that component. So in other words, this title will not affect this component down here. Okay, if I call another title in here, it will not. They're completely separate. Okay, so title here. What did I do? Okay, so title, let's just say we'll replace this with this data binding. Okay, I'll call it the same thing, data binding. I'll put an exclamation mark to know that it's a different text than the other one. And let me minimize this so we can see the output right away. And I'll close this. Well, I'll just shrink it a little bit more. Okay, so here's the output of that page, and this is our code. Okay, so now when I type something here, I'm going to show that the actual data actually reflects over here. Okay, it's live, right? Angular reflects it live. Now, for data binding, I want to display this title with the exclamation mark right in here. I'm hard-coded this in here. I want to make that dynamic. So using the Angular expression, a pair of double curlies, I put that in there, and I'll put the title variable here. You can put spaces in there if you want, doesn't matter. Okay, if I save this file, you see that it changes right away with the exclamation mark. So this is one-way data binding from the source to the view. Okay, by using a pair of curlies here. It's one way because I change data here. It shows in the view. I cannot change this data and goes back, right? So two-way is going in both directions. This one is just changing data going one way. So you changing the state here, it goes out. Okay, I could do another one. This one I'm just displaying text right directly to an H1 tag as an HTML text. I could do something like an href, and that will go to like Google, for example. Okay, that's another variable. And maybe out here I have a link that will go to Google, right? And I'll put Google here. Okay, for now, if I refresh, save this, the link is there. As you can see, it's blank. It doesn't go anywhere because I didn't put that here. So to put that link in there, I just put that variable right in here, wrap it with the curlies, like that. Okay, if I save that, now you see that on the bottom left, you see the link, it goes to google.com right down here. If I click it, it goes to Google. Okay, so that's data binding. Again, one way. I'm not changing the data here from the view. I'm just changing from the source out to the view. So you can display data out to anywhere on your website. you can bind to an attribute and a tag. Okay. Now I can do another one down here. You can do something like an well, I don't have an image here, but do we have an image? Maybe not. I'll do another one. A href that will go to maybe go to a different site, and we'll put it here. Go to Facebook. Okay, this one goes to Facebook, and let's put a type symbol there. So here is the second link. Again, doesn't go anywhere yet. And I'll put another link down here. Maybe I'll call it FB. I should have called it the other one for Google. So HTTP. Okay. So that will go to Facebook. And then if I go to here, okay, I can do the same thing like I did here. The other way is you can wrap this with a square bracket and then put the FB, which is the variable here. That's another way to do it. So you can do it this way by writing out the attribute and then you wrap it with the curlies in here, or you wrap the attribute with a square bracket and then you put the actual variable here. Okay, you don't want to do this again. You don't want to do this. If you do that, it's not allowed because it's like confusing. Okay, I'm binding this and I'm binding that, so it doesn't know what to do. As you can see, if I do this, if I save it, it won't work. Actually, it don't show. It doesn't show anything here unless you press the inspection, and it will tell you that there is an error. Okay, in the console, there's an error. Okay, you cannot bind that way. So yeah, I forgot to mention that the word interpolation is the word how we describe this. I'm doing a string interpolation. Okay, when you mix a Angular expression or variable like this inside the HTML and you put inside a pair of curlies like this is called a string interpolation, or just the term interpolation, because this is being parsed by the engine and then it replaces this whole block of code here with the actual data from the source. Okay, so here I need to remove that if I'm using this method. So if I save that, then now it should work. As you can see, if I click that, it goes right to it should take you to Facebook. I probably have the wrong link or something. Okay, so both works just fine. And that's what it means when we look at this. We have the two different methods here. You do expression this way, or you can do using the target or the bind. The bind, I didn't do that one yet, but you can also do that as well. And that's just by saying instead of href, I put the bind href. Okay, this one here is equivalent to this. Okay, so if I save that, it should still work just as before. Well, I mean, I can't. Right, again, right? It's equivalent, so I should not put that curlies there. Okay, save that, and so here we go. We're back to that process. Okay, so you have kind of like 3 ways basically to do that. Now the other way is coming from the view to the source. Okay, to do that we need to attach to an event. So the one-way binding coming from the view to the source is through events. If you remember JavaScript, we're talking about events, things like a key is pressed on the keyboard, you hit enter key when you click something on the web page, click a button, when you mouse over something, hover something, with the mouse leaves a certain tag. That's what it means. Okay, and so you have 2 ways of doing that. One is again kind of similar to this 2 part here, right? Except we're using the a pair of parentheses. You will wrap that in with the target. The target will be the event itself, like a click event or a key press, a key up, key down, mouse enter, and so on, the actual event name. And then here we have the on followed by a dash and then the actual event. Same thing as we do here. Again, this is coming from the view to the source. Okay, so let's do an example here. Back to our example, and I'll show the output here so we can see that as well. I'm going to add a put a BR here, maybe a few BR, and I'll create an input. So again, data coming in from the view, it has to come from an element that is accepting inputs. Things like the input element. That's one of them. The other one is like the select element, right? These, I think like 3 of them, and we have the text area. Okay, usually those 3 are your usual HTML input type of selectors. And of course, in Angular, you have your own custom selector. You can create your own to accept input from that as well. But in terms of HTML, you're pretty much stuck here. Well, I guess you can also use the button too. But I'll show you using the typical input element here. So in an element such as the input, we can have something like this. You can give an ID if you want, right? Call it maybe just data. Maybe that's confusing. Okay, we'll just call it name. And usually, if you leave it like that, right? If you just leave it like that, if I save it, it's just a blank box. Okay, it's nothing there. I can type something there if I want, right? So you can set default values to the input box by using the value attribute, and you put like ABC here. Below, you see that that's the default data is assigned to that value. Okay, and if you remember JavaScript, I'll do F12. You can get the data from this attribute value by doing something like, let's just say var data is equal to document. I'm going to target that tag. Get element by ID, and the ID is, I think we call it name. Okay, so now name is data now has this tag, and to get the actual data, we type in value and then hit enter. You see that I have ABC. Whatever I put here will be assigned to this data variable. So this is data binding, coming from the view to a source. Okay, in JavaScript, right? It follows the same concept in Angular. Okay, so now I can bind the data from here to a variable inside this source, and this data could be called data. Okay, I call data, and I'll have some default data ABC. Okay, so when you do this, it's a little bit tricky because again, you have to use the event function, right? So in other words, I have to call something like the click event, right? It's not button, so it would make sense. Maybe the key press or key up event. It's very common, right? When you type something, key up. And then I need to call a function. If you remember JavaScript, exactly kind of the same thing, right? I call a function any function I want, pretty much. You can call it, you know, maybe get data. Okay, and get data goes in here, and then I have a function in here somewhere called get data. Okay, and inside the get data here, I can change the data itself, this data here, and then I'll display the data out here, maybe right below it. We'll put the data, and I'll wrap it with the data, I mean curlies. So, well, let's just save this first, see what happens. Okay, you can see the data is ABC. Okay, if I make like 1, 2, 3, notice it doesn't change ABC. Okay, it doesn't change that because I did not bind it yet. I didn't make any updates. So I'm binding the input here tag to a key up event. It calls a function called data, and the data here goes in here. And what I want to do is I want to grab the actual value in this field. How do you do that? Right? In JavaScript, I just showed you, you need to target this element first. Okay, but in here, we can target this data, the ABC here, through a let's see, the event. I think it's the event dot value. Let's see if that is true. So I'm passing a value here to an event. I'll call this the value, just a variable name. And then the value comes in this case it will be ABC123, and I'm going to assign that to the data itself. I'm going to change that to the value. So to get the data, you have to use the keyword this, otherwise it won't work. If you just put data, it's thinking it's a local variable inside this function, right? So to get the actual data outside in the class, you need to use the this. If you remember objects in the class, right, is equal to the actual value coming in from this function. Okay. So you see that it actually does something, right? It does something. It removes that data here. Initially it was like ABC, but when I press something, it replaces that. So that means the value is not coming in correctly, right? So to get the actual value, you can put in here a variable called maybe something like name, exactly the same as this one here. Okay, and I can put I think name. Well, before I do that, let's go back and fix this first. So let's remove this name for now again. The reason why it's not working, I think, event here, because I'm missing another property here called the target. Okay, so the event followed by the target, which is this input target tag, and get its value. I pass the value, in this case, to the function called getData, and then I'm changing the data to this new value. Let's see if that's the case. I'm going to save that and see if it changes over here now. So ABC 1, 2, 3, right? So you can see that it changes live. Okay, I'm binding the data from the input tag through an event handler, an event called keyUp. The handler is called getData. Again, a handler is just a function, a special function that will get triggered and do some stuff like we did here. And in this case, I'm passing the event, which is the actual value, the event that target the value itself. In this case, it would be ABC1234, and I pass that to this function. It gets that function, assigns that to the data, which is this data here, and then it changes the state of that data, and it updates that on the view outside back here. So that's what you see. That reflects right away. So it goes through this cycle in live because of this function. If I don't call this function, it doesn't work. It won't update the data. Okay. Now this part here is, as you can see, I'm getting actual value. So I mean, you can do it this way, or you can do like, okay, I'm going to just pass in the event. If you do the event only, then the value here is, you call it value because it's a little bit confusing. So usually you would say like E, right? And then you do E dot target dot value. It's similar to what we saw earlier up here. I said event dot target dot value. Okay, so this is the same thing. If I do that, if I save it, again, you should see it's still working fine. All right. So that's one way of binding data from the view to the source down here, and we actually output the data back to the view again. So going out from the source to the view, coming from the view to the source. Okay, that's one way to do that. Another way I want to show you earlier was that you can, instead of saying event dot something something like this here, you can put an ID here, followed by the pound sign, or prepend that with the pound sign, just like the ID in CSS. You give it a name. I can call it name or data. This name is not this name here, by the way. It's just something else. So I can use that here. Then when I get the data function call, I put the data, the name here, followed by the value. Okay, so this ID here is really already this whole tag. And I just return the value to that function. So back to what we had earlier, just the value itself. And then I can assign the value to data. And you see that it should work just like before. Let's see. So there it is. Okay, so that's another way to do it. So again here, you have to attach to an event. I'm using the parentheses to wrap the event name in there. If you prefer to use the on keyword, not on, it's the, I think it's the bind, right? Bind on keyword. And let's see if I save that. I think I might have it wrong. It's probably just bind. Is it bind or is it just on? Too many languages to remember. Okay, so the on keyword is equivalent to the parentheses. Again, if you wrap the parentheses, you don't want to use the on dash. Okay. All right, so that's one-way bindings going in both directions. And then the other one is called the two-way binding. That is by doing what we did here. Like you're basically combining this to something like this. Okay, and we do that by using the example in the book in the component here, the Hello World example. As you can see, instead of doing both of those, you could just bind directly by using this method here. Okay, the keyword ng, and this is important, is case sensitive, so make sure that's spelled exactly as it is. Ng followed by the word model, and then you wrap that with a pair of parentheses, and you enclose that with a pair of square brackets. Okay, that equals the name of your identifier. Okay, this name here is a variable name in your code. Okay, so back in here, if I were to do that again inside another tag, well, we can wrap with the same tag here. So the input tag here, let me just maximize this again. I can replace all of these here with a square brackets, pair of parentheses, followed by the name ng model, capital M, then equals the name of the field, which is data. Okay, this data here is this data here. So now I'm not calling this function at all now. This is not used at this point. I'm just calling this data directly here. And at the same time, when I make changes, it should reflect the current state of that data and outputs it back to the data here. Okay, so save that and let's see if this works. Okay, so you can see it's much shorter than what I had earlier. You have to call a function, and then the function gets called here, and then you can output it back to the view, either to the data here or to the actual data here. But this one here we do in two ways. Okay, so the data here is actually outputting to this input tag live at the same time. We can't tell because it's the same way you would see here in the view. But really that's what happened behind the scene. Okay, when you type something here, it changes this data. It binds to this data here. It updates the state. Notice I didn't have to call the function to update it, right? It updates automatically in here live, and then it outputs right back to where this data is located. That's what happens. We can't see it. but that's what it is. And we only show that by outputting this data to a different location so you can see that it's actually happening live behind the scene. Okay, again, this is just one way to do a data binding, but it follows the same method here. This is an ng model followed by your variable. Later on, when you write your own custom element, you can actually use your own element in here, your own directives in here to do data binding. But that's another video for another time. So I hope this is helpful, clarifies some of the things about data binding. Again, rewatch this video again if you're not confused. If you're still confusing, you can always send me email, post a comment, and I'll be happy to reply. Thank you.